Section 12 of Tales of Troy, Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Tales of Troy, Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities, by Andrew Lang. Section 12, The Battles with the Amazons and Memnon, the Death of Achilles, continued. Memnon was the most beautiful of men, except Paris and Achilles, and his home was in a country that borders on the land of sunrising. There he was reared by the lily maidens called Hesperides, till he came to his full strength, and commanded the whole army of the Aethiopes. For their arrival Priam wished to wait, but Polydamas advised that the Trojans should give back Helen to the Greeks, with jewels twice as valuable as those which she had brought from the house of Menelaus. Then Paris was very angry, and said that Polydamas was a coward, for it was little to Paris that Troy should be taken and burned in a month, if for a month he could keep Helen of the fair hands. At length Memnon came, leading a great army of men who had nothing white about them but the teeth, so fiercely the sun burned on them in their own country. The Trojans had all the more hopes of Memnon, because on his long journey from the land of sunrising and the river Oceanus that girdles the round world, he had been obliged to cross the country of the Solymi. Now the Solymi were the fiercest of men, and rose up against Memnon. But he and his army fought them for a whole day, and defeated them, and drove them to the hills. When Memnon came, Priam gave him a great cup of gold, full of wine to the brim, and Memnon drank the wine at one draught. But he did not make great boasts of what he could do, like poor Penthesilea. For, said he, whether I am a good man at arms will be known in battle where the strength of men is tried. So now let us turn to sleep, for to wake and drink wine all through the night is an ill beginning of war. Then Priam praised his wisdom, and all men betook them to bed. But the bright dawn rose unwillingly next day to throw light on the battle where her son was to risk his fife. Then Memnon led out the dark clouds of his men into the plain, and the Greeks foreboded evil when they saw so great a new army of fresh and unwearied warriors. But Achilles, leading them in his shining armor, gave them courage. Memnon fell upon the left wing of the Greeks and on the men of Nestor. And first he slew Ereuthus, and then attacked Nestor's young son Antilochus, who, now that Patroclus had fallen, was the dearest friend of Achilles. On him Memnon leaped, like a lion on a kid, but Antilochus lifted a huge stone from the plain, a pillar that had been set on the tomb of some great warrior long ago, and the stone smote full on the helmet of Memnon, who reeled beneath the stroke. But Memnon seized his heavy spear, and drove it through shield and corslet of Antilochus, even into his heart, and he fell and died beneath his father's eyes. Then Nestor, in great sorrow and anger, strode across the body of Antilochus, and called to his other son Thrasymedes, "Come and drive afar this man that has slain thy brother, for if fear be in thy heart, thou art no son of mine, nor of the race of Periclymenus, who stood up in battle even against the strong man Heracles." But Memnon was too strong for Thrasymedes, and drove him off, while old Nestor himself charged sword in hand, though Memnon bade him begone, for he was not minded to strike so aged a man, and Nestor drew back, for he was weak with age. Then Memnon and his army charged the Greeks, slaying and stripping the dead. But Nestor had mounted his chariot and driven to Achilles, weeping and imploring him to come swiftly and save the body of Antilochus. And he sped to meet Memnon, who lifted a great stone, the landmark of a field, and drove it against the shield of the son of Peleus. But Achilles was not shaken by the blow. He ran forward and wounded Memnon over the rim of his shield. Yet wounded as he was, Memnon fought on and struck his spear through the arm of Achilles, for the Greeks fought with no sleeves of bronze to protect their arms. Then Achilles drew his great sword and flew on Memnon, and with sword strokes They lashed at each other on shield and helmet, and the long horsehair crests of the helmets were shorn off and flew down the wind, and their shields rang terribly beneath the sword strokes. They thrust at each other's throats between shield and visor of the helmet. They smote at knee and thrust at breast, and the armor rang about their bodies, and the dust from beneath their feet rose up in a cloud around them, like mist round the falls of a great river in flood. So they fought, neither of them yielding a step, till Achilles made so rapid a thrust that Memnon could not parry it, and the bronze sword passed clean through his body beneath the breastbone, and he fell, and his armor clashed as he fell. Then Achilles, wounded as he was and weak from loss of blood, did not stay to strip the golden armor of Memnon, but shouted his war cry and pressed on, for he hoped to enter the gate of Troy with the fleeing Trojans, and all the Greeks followed after him. So they pursued, slaying as they went, and the Scaean gate was choked with a crowd of men pursuing and pursued. In that hour would the Greeks have entered Troy and burned the city and taken the women captive. But Paris stood on the tower above the gate, and in his mind was anger for the death of his brother Hector. He tried the string of his bow and found it frayed, for all day he had showered his arrows on the Greeks. So he chose a new bowstring and fitted it, and strung the bow, and chose an arrow from his quiver, and aimed at the ankle of Achilles, where it was bare beneath the greave, or leg guard of metal, that the god had fashioned for him. Through the ankle flew the arrow, and Achilles wheeled round, weak as he was, and stumbled, and fell, and the armor that the god had wrought was defiled with dust and blood. Then Achilles rose again and cried, "What coward has smitten me with a secret arrow from afar? Let him stand forth, and meet me with sword and spear." So speaking, he seized the shaft with his strong hands, and tore it out of the wound, and much blood gushed, and darkness came over his eyes. Yet he staggered forward, striking blindly, and smote Orythion, a dear friend of Hector, through the helmet, and others he smote, but now his force failed him, and he leaned on his spear, and cried his war cry, and said, "Cowards of Troy, ye shall not all escape my spear, dying as I am." But as he spoke, he fell, and all his armor rang around him. Yet the Trojans stood apart and watched, and as hunters watch a dying lion, not daring to go nigh him, so the Trojans stood in fear till Achilles drew his latest breath. Then from the wall the Trojan women raised a great cry of joy over him who had slain the noble Hector. And thus was fulfilled the prophecy of Hector, that Achilles should fall in the Scaean gateway by the hand of Paris. Then the best of the Trojans rushed forth from the gate to seize the body of Achilles and his glorious armor. But the Greeks were as eager to carry the body to the ships, that it might have due burial. Round the dead Achilles men fought long and sore, and both sides were mixed, Greeks and Trojans, so that men dared not shoot arrows from the walls of Troy, lest they should kill their own friends. Paris and Aeneas and Glaucus, who had been the friend of Sarpedon, led the Trojans, and Aias and Ulysses led the Greeks. For we are not told that Agamemnon was fighting in this great battle of the war. Now, as angry wild bees flock round a man who is taking their honeycombs, so the Trojans gathered round Aias, striving to stab him. But he set his great shield in front, and smote and slew all that came within reach of his spear. Ulysses, too, struck down many, and though a spear was thrown and pierced his leg near the knee, he stood firm, protecting the body of Achilles. At last Ulysses caught the body of Achilles by the hands and heaved it upon his back, and so limped towards the ships. But Aias and the men of Aias followed, turning round if ever the Trojans ventured to come near, and charging into the midst of them. Thus very slowly they bore the dead Achilles across the plain, through the bodies of the fallen and the blood, till they met Nestor in his chariot, and placed Achilles therein, and swiftly Nestor drove to the ships. There the women, weeping, washed Achilles' comely body, and laid him on a bier with a great white mantle over him. And all the women lamented and sang dirges, and the first was Briseis, who loved Achilles better than her own country, and her father, and her brothers whom he had slain in war. The Greek princes, too, stood round the body, weeping and cutting off their long locks of yellow hair, a token of grief and an offering to the dead. Men say that forth from the sea came Thetis of the silver feet, the mother of Achilles, with her ladies, the deathless maidens of the water. They rose up from their glassy chambers below the sea, moving on, many and beautiful, like the waves on a summer day. And their sweet song echoed along the shores, and fear came upon the Greeks. Then they would have fled, but Nestor cried, "Hold, flee not, young lords of the Achaeans. Lo, she that comes from the sea is his mother, with the deathless maidens of the waters, to look on the face of her dead son." Then the sea nymphs stood around the dead Achilles, and clothed him in the garments of the gods, fragrant raiment. And all the 9 muses, one to the other replying with sweet voices, began their lament. Next, the Greeks made a great pile of dry wood, and laid Achilles on it, and set fire to it, till the flames had consumed his body except the white ashes. These they placed in a great golden cup, and mingled with them the ashes of Patroclus. And above all they built a tomb like a hill, high on a headland above the sea, that men for all time may see it as they go sailing by, and may remember Achilles. Next they held in his honor foot races, and chariot races, and other games, and Thetis gave splendid prizes. Last of all, when the games were ended, Thetis placed before the chiefs the glorious armor that the god had made for her son on the night after the slaying of Patroclus by Hector. "Let these arms be the prize of the best of the Greeks," she said, "and of him that saved the body of Achilles out of the hands of the Trojans." Then stood up on one side Aias, and on the other Ulysses, for these two had rescued the body, and neither thought himself a worse warrior than the other. Both were the bravest of the brave, and if Aias was the taller and stronger, and upheld the fight at the ships on the day of the valor of Hector, Ulysses had alone withstood the Trojans, and refused to retreat even when wounded, and his courage and cunning had won for the Greeks the luck of Troy. Therefore old Nestor arose and said, "This is a luckless day when the best of the Greeks are rivals for such a prize. He who is not the winner will be heavy at heart, and will not stand firm by us in battle, as of old, and hence will come great loss to the Greeks. Who can be a just judge in this question? For some men will love Aias better, and some will prefer Ulysses, and thus will arise disputes among ourselves. Lo, have we not here among us many Trojan prisoners, waiting till their friends pay their ransom in cattle and gold and bronze and iron? These hate all the Greeks alike, and will favor neither Aias nor Ulysses. Let them be the judges, and decide who is the best of the Greeks, and the man who has done most harm to the Trojans." Agamemnon said that Nestor had spoken wisely. The Trojans were then made to sit as judges in the midst of the assembly, and Aias and Ulysses spoke, and told the stories of their own great deeds, of which we have heard already. But Aias spoke roughly and discourteously, calling Ulysses a coward and a weakling. "Perhaps the Trojans know," said Ulysses quietly, "whether they think that I deserve what Aias has said about me, that I am a coward, and perhaps Aias may remember that he did not find me so weak when we wrestled for a prize at the funeral of Patroclus." Then the Trojans all with one voice said that Ulysses was the best man among the Greeks, and the most feared by them, both for his courage and his skill in stratagems of war. On this the blood of Aias flew into his face, and he stood silent and unmoving, and could not speak a word, till his friends came round him and led him away to his hut. And there he sat down and would not eat or drink, and the night fell. Long he sat, musing in his mind, and then rose and put on all his armor, and seized a sword that Hector had given him one day, when they two fought in a gentle passage of arms, and took courteous farewell of each other. And Aias had given Hector a broad sword belt wrought with gold. This sword, Hector's gift, Aias took, and went towards the hut of Ulysses, meaning to carve him limb from limb, for madness had come upon him in his great grief. Rushing through the night to slay Ulysses, he fell upon the flock of sheep that the Greeks kept for their meat, and up and down among them he went, smiting blindly till the dawn came. And lo, his senses returned to him, and he saw that he had not smitten Ulysses, but stood in a pool of blood among the sheep that he had slain. He could not endure the disgrace of his madness, and he fixed the sword, Hector's gift, with its hilt firmly in the ground, and went back a little way, and ran and fell upon the sword, which pierced his heart. And so died the great Aias, choosing death before a dishonored life. End of section 12. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.